Hello everyone, welcome to Lecture 11, Theme 11, South Africa's Transition to Democracy and Transitional Justice. You can look at these outcomes on the PDF slides that are already loaded on ULink, but I'm trying to keep this video short, so I'm going to skip this. This section will be actually broken down into three parts. This first one will be what led to the negotiations, then it will be the birth of the constitutional state in South Africa, followed by the Transitional Justice and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRC. Now, the Transitional Justice and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission section is the most important section for your exam, and I'll spend a bit longer on that section. These first two sections, I'm just going to discuss a few of the key points to keep the videos on those sections short, and you can have a look at my slides and the texts in your own time. So the first section is what led to the negotiations. Have a look at this poster at the bottom here, just an anti-apartheid activist poster. There were many of them, of course, but this was a nice one. I like the whole black and white thing and how that was incorporated into the poster. Now let's start at the beginning with theoretical foundations. There are some tricky concepts to try and understand here, so I'll take a couple of minutes to explain those. The first one is democratization. Now you guys know what democracy is because we covered this in Theme 5 earlier on in the semester. But democratization itself is an actual process when one moves from a coercive system or an authoritarian system like apartheid in South Africa to a democratic system. And it does this in sort of a matter of levels. That's why it's a process, not an event. So it's a process by which societies develop towards democracy, and as such it's part of like a continuum. It starts with authoritarian rule or coercive rule, and then it goes through to democratization or liberalization, political liberalization. Then it moves on to democratic governance, or we refer to that as democratic consolidation. And therefore, democratization as a process is a transitional stage and not an end state. So a very important point to just reiterate here is that democratization is a process of becoming democratic. So it happens in stages, and once you have democratized, then you consolidate your democracy, and then you can start talking about the quality of your democracy, because then you're already a democracy. So it's a process through which things like the rule of law, elections, and political institutions in favor of promoting accountability are formed. For example, in South Africa, remember the Chapter 9s we spoke about in the Trias Politica? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Now, it's also important quickly to explain negotiations. So there are obviously going to be contending parties in any conflicting situation. So contending or conflicting, it's the same thing. That just means parties who are against each other for whatever reason. And at some point, they're either going to fight and kill each other, or they're going to realize they have to enter into negotiations. Now, negotiations can be elite-driven, they can be elite response, in other words, to pressure from below, and another important point is with regard to stalemates and negotiations. So, elite-driven negotiations, that means that a ruling elite initiates political reform from a position of strength. In the case of South Africa, one could say that the National Party at the time, they saw the negotiation process that they were about to enter into in the early 1990s as an elite tool. They believed they could control the negotiations and ensure that they had an outcome that was obviously favorable to them. So the NP would be in control. Another kind of explanation around negotiations is with regard to elite response or pressure from below. This would mean, for example, the National Party capitulating to pressure from the anti-apartheid movement. So in other words, the power of the liberation struggle was so great that it pressurized the ruling elite towards negotiations. Then stalemates. Now the stalemates, that basically is a stalemate is attained when the different antagonists, that is the different conflicting parties, acknowledge that the conflict that they're experiencing cannot be won on either terms, but instead they have to compromise. In other words, both parties or all parties in the conflict realize that they've exhausted all other avenues and that they have to enter into compromise. So in other words, they've reached a stalemate. And this is the case in the South African example. Now, this leads to the next point around the ripe moment. I've put this little picture of tomatoes down here in the corner so that you can try and remember. They look juicy and ripe, right? So this is to help you remember the notion of the ripe moment, which I'll cover in the next slide. So, It is in the instance when conflicting parties realize that their unilateral efforts, that means that their efforts on their own, they will not be able to solve the conflict that they're all involved in, and as such they have to resort to negotiations. So this stalemate results in what is termed a ripe moment. William Zartman came up with that phrase, a ripe moment. Now the ripe moment is centered on the notion that the different conflicting or contending parties have of a mutually hurting stalemate. A mutually hurting stalemate basically refers to the idea that neither party, neither conflicting or contending party can win in a situation anymore. So whatever they do, it will still hurt both of them or all of them. So it's a mutually hurting stalemate. They can't move beyond where they are. Therefore, they recognize that that provides the ripe moment where there is a conducive environment for all the parties that are contending or conflicting to enter into negotiations with each other. This, then, is the so-called ripe moment. So in the ripe moment, conflicting parties can continue to hurt each other, but no party can win decisively. So in South Africa's case, there were a number of different reasons why the different parties involved came to the recognition that they would have to negotiate. There were mostly domestic and international factors that led to this ripe moment. And the conflicting parties in this instance were the National Party-led state and the ANC-led liberation movement. So, I'd like you to go through the next few slides. I just give you a description of the context that led to the negotiations taking place. It goes on for a couple of slides. And then I talk about the ripe moment itself and how the ripe moment was forced because of a number of domestic and international factors. So I've given you the exact page numbers where you can find the domestic factors and the international factors in the SA Politics textbook. This chapter is loaded on Ulink for you already. So please go onto Ulink and find that chapter and have a look at all the different factors, domestic and international, that led to the so-called ripe moment.